Thank you. Thank you for all of you for being here and trying to remember my grandfather, K N Guruswamy. I think that I've never really thought that I would write an article on him or a memoir on him. It was not particularly on my agenda or on my the kind of thing that I normally do. But it was triggered actually by my nephew who is here, Nikhil. He had asked me to write a brief piece for his wedding publication called Wedding Herald. And initially I said I was not inclined to do that because I never write on personalities or in case I never wrote on family, etc. So it wasn't kind of my this thing. But then I thought, and I always write, whatever I've written is mostly on public affairs, politics, economics, and current affairs kind of thing. But then, and also I don't focus on personalities, which is not my forte. But then I thought, on second thoughts, I thought that grandfather had need to be, something about him needed to be remembered. And there was something that was lacking in what people thought about him. Even people who knew him, I thought, which I think. And so I wrote something very fast. And though he had asked me for a 500-word piece, I wrote 1,800 words because that's how long it became in just a couple of days. Normally, you can't write this in a couple of days, but the wedding was very close. And it had to be finished by that. And also, I put it as grandfather and grandmother, and which he published it. So I went back to this history to answer the question, what triggered in my this thing? And that was because I thought that there was something that needed to be remembered about him and his what he had achieved and his personality and that kind of thing. Over the subsequent years, I was thinking on that. This was 2016, October. And last year, I did do some research also. The person who did the research for me is not here, Manjula. C.G. Manjula was a former Prajavani journalist who helped me a lot with going to the archives, trying to find some references. And she did a lot of interesting work, and that I found many things I didn't know came out because of her. We tried to find out something about the letter that I found from B.K. Garudachar, who was a very famous personality of that grandfather had given him some, participated in his journalistic venture in a Kannada newspaper in 1938, which I found in grandfather's thing. So, but we couldn't find much. Maybe it was the paper didn't come out, but we don't know. We did some research, but so we got other information also. So then the idea was brewing in my mind, and I wrote something last year. It was published at the start of the 75th year, and then I decided let me expand that and put more details, more photographs, more documents. So grandfather was essentially a businessman. That was his basic thing, which he inherited the business, his toddy business, which is a caste business. We belong to a caste of toddy tappers, and therefore my great-grandfather came from Kanekal, which is now in the border of Karnataka and Andhra. Those days in the larger, what is called Bellary district. But now there are modern districts, and it's across the border in Chitradurga. So after that, when his whole life was a business life, so how did he get interested in journalism is an important thing. Journalism was only one part of what he did, and starting a newspaper was really not his main activity, either before that or subsequently. It was not, I think, really started for any, as a business itself, in my opinion, because he was making huge amount of money during the Second World War and subsequently also. And basically, he was not, so that was his main focus of activity. And he was with his partner and his friend K. Venkatachalaiah, about whom I have written also. He was important personality of Bangalore of those days. And Venkatachalaiah helped him as a very capable and a very efficient organizer of his businesses. He himself was not interested in the day-to-day activity of running a business. And that may look strange, but that was true. He left it to his partner and his managers, which may not be. So I thought of him as a person who was very, but he had a very sound judgment and he had a sound understanding of people. And most of his investments in the liquor trade, originally in toddy and then toddy arak and later on in arak, were all successful over a very long period. My great-grandfather died in 1928 and grandfather died in 1990, so about 50 to 55 years, 60, almost 55 to 60 years of continuous success in a business and in the liquor trade. In the newspaper, he was not fully involved. Even Venkatachalaiah was not fully involved because they were fully involved in the liquor trade. And they were doing huge amount of money, and this paper was not making any profit at all. In fact, it made huge losses, which I have recorded. And even 10 years later, it was making losses. And he put in subsequent money. There's a document in the board of directors, which I have given in the book, in 1958, where he had loaned more than almost 6 lakhs of rupees, and there was interest. He waived the interest. So he put a lot of interest in that. There was no money in that. Even when I came back in 1976, I spoke to Venkatachalaiah. He said, "There's no money in this. This is not for money at all. This is not for business. It has got a lot of prestige. It's got a lot of." So I doubt it was a business venture. He didn't see it as a business venture. Grandfather didn't see it. Nor did Venkatachalaiah really see it as a business venture. So, and there was anyway a huge amount of money to be made in the liquor trade, in which they knew the insides of that business. This was a totally new kind of a business, totally most unlikely. And that's what I really said, actually. He's an unlikely founder. But he himself was a man, I think the BIC person has, in his introduction, which I didn't see, has used the word flamboyant. I didn't think of that word, but I think it's a good word, actually. It's a good word. He was a person who really enjoyed life. He was not a narrow kind of businessman. He was a very large-hearted businessman. And he was a very robust personality. He liked physical exercise. He had a huge, very strong body. And he had a lot of physical exercise, bodybuilding equipment in his house. And then he was a shikari, so he was an outdoor man. And he was a horse rider, and he liked racing, horse racing, and we used to go to the riding club. All that I have already given this thing in that. So how did he get interested in something that was totally unlike that? But the only thing I never spoke to him on this. In fact, he never spoke on all these matters. In fact, many of these old matters, especially since the time I came back in 1976 when my father died, he never spoke on all these matters. We didn't speak on the past very much, so I didn't know many of his friendships. I knew them indirectly, but through other people. But B.K. Garudachar I did not know was a friend, and I only knew about it when I went through his papers and I found this letter. And then I found this plaque in National College where Garudachar was an important personality, and his name is next to Garudachar's name. Venkatachalaiah does write in his story of Deccan Herald that he started saying that he said that I was running a paper called Matrubhumi. Again, I couldn't find any details on that. We did try to find, maybe at some point something may be found, but at the moment we are not done, so we have to leave it like that. So this is the rough idea, and but he had a lot of perseverance. He put in a lot of money. He persevered for the first 10 years, and but he didn't. But they were two. But he was. We had managers, and subsequently, my father was put in the business, and he devoted all his life and his time to building the paper. Because grandfather and Venkatachalaiah were not fully involved. They were fully involved in the liquor trade. So the building of the paper was left to my father as such, and he had a free rein as far as that went. So the building of the paper went to him. So though he was not a conventional newspaper baron in the sense of Beaverbrook or Rupert Murdoch or something like that, because this was an important thing, but it was not fundamental to his personality, which was business. And the thing that I liked most about him was that he loved life, and he lived life to the hilt is the expression. And flamboyant is one word. Another word is probably Epicurean, I would say. I called it joie de vivre. He had lived, enjoyed life in all its aspects. Bon vivant is another word you can probably think of this thing. This is the rough thing. In any case, I don't think I'll talk more because other people are there. And anyway, I've written this article. Last year, we published the article and expanded now much more on various aspects of him. But my own thing was that in his business, I've dealt with him right from 76 onwards to 91, directly working with him. I found him very clear-headed in his business, which I've written about again. Very clear-headed, and he knew his priorities. He knew what was important, and he had a sound. I think V.K. Narasimhan was a former editor of Deccan Herald, was earlier in Indian Express. He came from Indian Express, and who was the editor of the Hindu. He put it very well, actually. In fact, I liked his. He said he reassured him when he left, as he retired in 1980. You have a sound business instinct, he said, and that I think is absolutely the right on dot. It's a perfect understanding of him. And ultimately, he was a businessman. But how did a businessman get into something called public life? And he was, of course, a man of the old world. He was a man who believed in Maharajas and aristocracy. I don't think he had much of an understanding of democracy as we understand it. But then the newspaper is nothing but democracy, He was also, as I've written also, he was for the Ediga community. He was a very major organizer, and right from 1944, he had organized the Mysore Ediga Association, Arya Ediga Association, and later on held huge conventions later in the 1958 and 61. But he was not particularly interested in the backward classes movement. That's the puzzle, that here's a person who had no interest even in the Miller Committee. After all, right from the Miller Committee of the Mysore Maharaja in 1918 or 1919, I forget the exact date, he did not participate, and I doubt he knew Havanur or Devrajas from that point of view. He was a traditionalist, but being a traditionalist, he entered the modern world because how he entered that is not fully understandable by me, but it's still, there's no doubt that he did. And that was something that newspapers had in it. And even from 58 to 1976, when I came, the newspaper did not make any profit. In fact, I don't think my father ever thought that newspapers are a place for profit or making money. They never looked at it as business. Those days, it was not business, So this is, I don't think I'll talk more because I think other people talk. If later on there is time, I certainly can answer questions or I can talk a little more about him. But I've already written quite a lot, so I think we'll give a chance to the others. So thank you.
Ravi, it is not the mere story of a family or the story of a clan. It is, in a non-trivial sense, the story of transformation of a backward community in the old Mysore state, in bringing themselves into the mainstream by the influence of some very, very enterprising elders who were originally into toddy business, how they diversified, how they got out of the rut is a story for the sociologists to investigate. I think, as I said, it is a very significant social movement to the old Mysore. The original propositors of the family was the elder Nettakallappa. He had the three sons, I think, one more perhaps. I knew three of them. One of the eldest was the K N Guruswamy. Second was K N Anjanappa. The third was Dr. Chandrasekhar Swamy, who was my neighbor 2 houses down. I've known that family because we were residents of the same locality for generations. Guruswamy was a sportsman, was an iconic figure. He was flashy cars. He had horseman. He was a shikari. And in those days, those were the things that attracted public attention. He was not to be more than that. He was not to be a gentleman. They were very successful in business, and in those days, by any standards, very aristocratic. He was known to be a gentleman and friendly person. His image comes through as a friendly person in spite of his great wealth and the flaunting of so much of the tokens of rights, as I could say. And I knew him. I knew his both the brothers. And in fact, Anjanappa was a client of mine in my professional days. More than my client, he was a friend of mine. In fact, I remember 52 years ago, when my wife was in the family way in Mysore, suddenly she had to be taken to a maternity home early morning, say 4 o'clock or so. I couldn't get in touch with anybody. I told Anjanappa. Anjanappa didn't have a driver. He himself, in his dressing gown, came, took my wife and my mother-in-law to a nursing home, maternity home. So that's from 52 years ago. He was very close to me. And Nettakal was a sportsman and a connoisseur of sports. So he developed a number of institutions, sporting institutions to flourish in the area. That old Basangudi area was a small area in those days. And we were all neighbors. My grandfather's family was an established family in the same neighborhood. And we used to watch Mr. Guruswamy going in his beautiful limousine, and sometimes on occasions riding a horse and all that. In those days, they're all very attractive factors in social life. I tell you, we can trivialize everything. But you must understand, in those days, toddy contractors was not held in high esteem by society or even the government. Those who belonged to the Ediga community were at the mercy of petty officials. And the transformation came when some leaders, for example, there were the well-known figures like Hari Kumar. He was a very, very enterprising, broad-minded, great visionary. It was he who was one of the leaders of that Ediga community who helped the transformation of the community from a backward toddy vending group into a social entity recognized by society for its contribution. And it was there was Mr. Mula Rangappa, his son Mula Bhaktavatsala had a management degree from an American university. He served a public company, I think in Nissan Machine Tools. Also, he worked as a personal manager, and he was a very enterprising man. That family, Mula Rangappa's family, was a very, very well-known family. Arthikare Venkatachalaiah, Mula Rangappa, Basuraj, Shinde, they were all Gaviappa, Ballari, Nagappa, Shumoga, they were all in those days. I was associated with one group or the other in the litigation. I don't refer to those litigations and the way the professional relationship. In fact, in the very big litigation among that group, I was responsible for bringing a settlement, which was very difficult in those days. That's for another day. That's not the relevant thing. But what I say is, the significance of the contribution of the elders of this community in the 40s of last century is a story of social evolution and social transformation of a tribal group, a clan, into a recognized component of a modern society. They diversified from toddy vending into education, into medicine, healthcare, hospitals, entertainment, cinema, diversified, and their children, the next generation, were well educated and broad-minded. And the significance of this is not a family, but a whole group transformed itself into an important component of a modern society. Deccan Herald was started, I think, under the great inspiration of, I think Sir Arcot Ramaswamy had something to do with this kind of inspiring of this group. I think K N Guruswamy and there's one Basuraj, Mula Rangappa, Guruswamy was, of course, the charming the cult figure of that group because of his popularity amongst in the locality. Deccan Herald was started as an assertion of the presence of this important community in the state. And that's how they opened themselves up into the mainstream and into politics. And first editor was Posan Joseph, and then a series of good editors. And also into the field of journalism, it was the most difficult thing to do in those days. And Shant Kumar, Tilak Kumar, Hari Kumar are the names which are associated with this transformation. They brought about a change in the philosophy of the paper. Originally it was an assertion of their place under the sun. The philosophy was given to it by the third generation, who was a social and economic philosophy, had their heart in the right place, just a little left of the center. And that philosophy inspired the philosophy of the newspaper itself. They gave this orientation of the newspaper into a democratic instrument of democratic, libertarian democratic tradition of the country. And I think that way the third generation has contributed not only to the growth of that community, that clan, but to the general widening of the vision of the old Mysore state into the values of modern democracy.
May we have Mr. G. N. Ranganatha Rao on stage, please.
ಸಭೆಗೆ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಸನ್ಮಾನ್ಯ ಶ್ರೀ ಹರಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರೇ ಮತ್ತು ಇಂದಿನ ಸಮಾರಂಭದ ಎಲ್ಲ ಗಣ್ಯರೇ, ಗಣ್ಯ ಸಭಿಕರೇ, ನಿಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಮೊದಲಿಗೆ ನನ್ನ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಮುಂಗಾರಿನ ತಂಪಿನ ಕಂಪಿನ ಹಿತಕರವಾದಂಥ ಸಂಜೆ. ತಂಪು ಹೊತ್ತಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಗುರು ಹಿರಿಯರನ್ನು ನೆನೆಯಬೇಕು, ಜ್ಞಾಪಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನಮ್ಮ ಜಾನಪದ ಗಾದೆ ಒಂದು ಹೇಳುತ್ತೆ. ಇಂಥ ತಂಪು ಹೊತ್ತಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ತಂಪೆರೆದಿರುವ ನಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರ ಅಜ್ಜ, ಆಧುನಿಕ ಕನ್ನಡ ಪತ್ರಿಕೋದ್ಯಮದ ಪಿತಾಮಹ ಶ್ರೀ ಕೆ ಎನ್ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರ ಸ್ಮರಣೆ ಮಾಡುವ ಅವಕಾಶ ನನ್ನ ಪಾಲಿಗೆ ಬಂದಿರುವುದು ನನ್ನ ಪುಣ್ಯ ಎಂದೇ ನಾನು ಭಾವಿಸುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಶ್ರೀ ಹರಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರು ಹೊಗಳು ಬಟ್ಟಂಗಿತನವನ್ನು ಮೆಚ್ಚಿಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ನನಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತು. ಆದರೆ ಸತ್ಪುರುಷರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ಮಹಾನುಭಾವರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತನಾಡುವಾಗ ಪ್ರಶಂಸೆಗೆ ಒಂದು ರೀತಿಯ ಮಾರ್ಗದರ್ಶಕ ಮೌಲ್ಯ ಪ್ರಾಪ್ತವಾಗುತ್ತದೆ. ನಾನು ಶ್ರೀ ಕೆ ಎನ್ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರು ಸ್ಥಾಪಿಸಿ ಬೆಳೆಸಿದ ಡೆಕ್ಕನ್ ಹೆರಾಲ್ಡ್ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರಜಾವಾಣಿ ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಈಗ 75ರ ಜನ್ಮೋತ್ಸವದ ಸಡಗರ, ಅಮೃತ ಮಹೋತ್ಸವದ ಸಂಭ್ರಮ. ಆದ್ದರಿಂದ ಶ್ರೀ ಕೆ ಎನ್ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರ ಸ್ಮರಣೆಗೆ ಇದೊಂದು ಅಮೃತ ಗಳಿಗೆಯೇ ಸರಿ ಎಂದು ನಾನು ಭಾವಿಸುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಎಂದೇ ಶ್ರೀ ಕೆ ಎನ್ ಹರಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರು ಬರೆದಿರುವ ನನ್ನ ಅಜ್ಜ ಅಜ್ಜಿ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ತುಂಬ ಸಂದರ್ಭೋಚಿತವಾದದ್ದು. ಮೊದಲಿಗೆ ನಾನು ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕೆಲವು ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿ ನಂತರ ಪೂಜ್ಯ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತನಾಡ್ತೇನೆ. ಇದೊಂದು ನಾನು ಮೊದಲೇ ಹೇಳಿದಾಗೆ ಅಜ್ಜ ಅನ್ನತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಮತೆ ಅಥವಾ ಹೊಗಳಿಕೆಗಳಿಂದ ಮುಕ್ತವಾದಂಥ, ಕಲರ್ ಕೊಡದೇ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಕಪ್ಪು ಬಿಳುಪಿನ ವಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ಕೃತಿ. ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವದ ಗುಣಲಕ್ಷಣಗಳು, ಪ್ರವೃತ್ತಿಗಳನ್ನು, ಅವರ ಪ್ರಧಾನ ಗುಣವಾದ ಉದ್ಯಮಶೀಲತೆಯನ್ನು ನಿರ್ಮೋಹಿಯಾಗಿ, ವಿತೌಟ್ ಎನಿ ಅಟ್ಯಾಚ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಆರ್ ವಿತೌಟ್ ಎನಿ ಎಕ್ಸಾಜರೇಷನ್, ನಿರ್ಮೋಹಿಯಾಗಿ ನಿರೂಪಿಸುವ ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ಬಾಹ್ಯ ಸೌಂದರ್ಯ ಹಾಗೂ ಅಂತರಂಗದ ಸತ್ವ ಸೌಂದರ್ಯಗಳಿಂದ ನಮ್ಮ ಮನಸ್ಸಿಗೆ ಗಮ್ಯವಾಗುತ್ತದೆ. ಶ್ರೀ ಹರಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರ ಈ ಬರವಣಿಗೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಮೆಚ್ಚಬೇಕಾದ ಅಂಶಗಳೆಂದರೆ ಅಜ್ಜ ಅಜ್ಜಿಯರ ಬದುಕನ್ನು ಸಮೀಕ್ಷಿಸುವಾಗ ಅವರು ತಾಳುವ ನಿರ್ಮೋಹ, ನಿರಾಪ್ತತೆ, ನಿರ್ಲಿಪ್ತತೆ ಮತ್ತು ವಸ್ತುನಿಷ್ಠತೆಯ ದೃಷ್ಟಿ ಮತ್ತು ಸಂಯಮ ಶಿಸ್ತುಗಳು. ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರ ವಂಶಪ್ರಜ್ಞೆ ಆಗಲಿ, ಪ್ರೀತಿ ವಾತ್ಸಲ್ಯಗಳಾಗಲಿ, ಕಳ್ಳಿನ ಉದ್ಯಮವಾಗಲಿ, ಶ್ರೀ ವೆಂಕಟಸ್ವಾಮಿ, ಶ್ರೀ ಆರ್ಕಾಟ್ ರಾಮಸ್ವಾಮಿ ಮೊದಲಿಯಾರ್, ಗರುಡಾಚಾರ್ ಅವರುಗಳೊಂದಿಗಿನ ಸಂಬಂಧಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಆಗಲಿ, ಡೆಕ್ಕನಾಳ ಸ್ಥಾಪಿಸಿದವರು ಯಾರು ಎನ್ನುವ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಎದ್ದ ಒಂದು ಸಣ್ಣ ವಿವಾದವಾಗಲಿ, ಇದಾವುದನ್ನು ಹರಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರು ನನ್ನ ಅಜ್ಜ ಎಂಬ ಸಂಬಂಧವಾಚಕದ ಪೂರ್ವಾಗ್ರಹದಿಂದ ನೋಡುವುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಒಬ್ಬ ಸಮಾಜ ವಿಜ್ಞಾನಿಯಂತೆ, ಒಬ್ಬ ಆಂಥ್ರಪಾಲಜಿಸ್ಟಂತೆ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಿಸುತ್ತಾರೆ. ಆತುರದ ನಿರ್ಧಾರಗಳಿಗೆ ಧಾವಿಸುವುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಡೆಕ್ಕನ್ ಹೆರಾಲ್ಡ್ ಸ್ಥಾಪನೆಯ ವಿಚಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಹರಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರು ಎಷ್ಟು ಆಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟಿವ್ ಆಗಿ, ವಸ್ತುನಿಷ್ಠವಾಗಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ಯಶಸ್ಸಿಗೆ ಹಲವು ಅಪ್ಪಂದಿರು, ಸೋಲು ಅನಾಥ. ಈ ಗಾದೆಯನ್ನು ನೆನಪಿಸುತ್ತಲೇ ಇಂದು ಅತ್ಯಗತ್ಯ ಎನಿಸಿರುವ ಬಹುಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿ ಮತ್ತು ಬಹುತ್ವದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅಜ್ಜಿ ಆ ಕಾಲಕ್ಕೆ ತಾಳಿದ್ದ ನಿಲುವನ್ನು ನಮ್ಮ ಗಮನಕ್ಕೆ ತರುತ್ತಾರೆ. ಹಿಂದೂ ಮುಸ್ಲಿಂ ಭಾವೈಕ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಅವರ ಭಾವೈಕ್ಯದ ಸಂತ ಮತ್ತು ಅವರ ಪಂಥದ ಅನುಯಾಯಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಆಶ್ರಮವೊಂದು ನಿರ್ಮಿಸಿಕೊಡಬೇಕೆಂದು ಅಜ್ಜಿ ಪಟ್ಟು ಹಿಡಿದದ್ದನ್ನು ಅವರು ನೆನಪಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತಾರೆ. ಇದು ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಭಾರತದ ಪ್ರಜ್ಞೆಗೆ, ಆತ್ಮಸಾಕ್ಷಿಗೆ ಎಚ್ಚರಿಕೆಯಾಗುತ್ತದೆ ಈ ಮಾತುಗಳು. ಇಂಥ ಶಿಸ್ತಿನ, ಸಂಯಮದ, ವಸ್ತುನಿಷ್ಠ ಅಧ್ಯಯನದಿಂದ ಕೂಡಿದ ಹರಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರ ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಸತ್ಯಪೂರ್ಣವಾದ ಚಾರಿತ್ರಿಕ ಮಹತ್ವ ಒದಗಿ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಕನ್ನಡ ಪತ್ರಿಕೋದ್ಯಮದ ವಿದ್ಯಾರ್ಥಿಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ಸಂಶೋಧಕರಿಗೆ ಇದೊಂದು ಮಾರ್ಗದರ್ಶನೀಯ ಆಕರ ಗ್ರಂಥ ಎಂದು ಹೇಳಲು ಸಂತೋಷವಾಗುತ್ತದೆ. ಇನ್ನು ಇಲ್ಲಿರುವ ಚಿತ್ರಗಳಂತೂ ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರ ಕುಟುಂಬದೊಂದಿಗೆ ಓದುಗರ ಆಪ್ತತೆ ಬೆಳೆಸುವಷ್ಟು ಆಕರ್ಷಕವಾಗಿದೆ. ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಸುಂದರವಾಗಿ ಪ್ರಿಂಟ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ತಮ್ಮ ಅಜ್ಜನ ಬದುಕನ್ನು, ಉದ್ಯಮಶೀಲತೆಯನ್ನು, ಪತ್ರಿಕೋದ್ಯಮವನ್ನು ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕರಿಗೆ ಮೊದಲ ಬಾರಿಗೆ ತೆರೆದಿಟ್ಟಿರುವ ಶ್ರೀ ಹರಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರು ಅಭಿನಂದನಾರ್ಹರು. ಅವರನ್ನು ನಾನು ಹೃತ್ಪೂರ್ವಕವಾಗಿ ಅಭಿನಂದಿಸುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಅಜ್ಜ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರನ್ನು ಹತ್ತಿರದಿಂದ ನೋಡುವ ಕೆಲವು ಅವಕಾಶಗಳು ನನಗೆ ಒದಗಿ ಬಂದಿದ್ದು, ಅವುಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದೆರಡನ್ನು ನಾನು ಈ ಸಂಜೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ಮರಿಸುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರಿಗೆ ಪತ್ರಿಕೋದ್ಯಮಿಯಾಗಿ ಪತ್ರಿಕಾಧರ್ಮದ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟ ಕಲ್ಪನೆ ಇತ್ತು. ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರನ್ನು ನೆನಪಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳುವುದೆಂದರೆ ಪತ್ರಿಕಾಧರ್ಮವನ್ನು ನೆನಪಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಂತೆಯೇ ಅಥವಾ ಸ್ಮರಿಸಿದಂತೆಯೇ. ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳು ಜನರಿಗೆ ಪಠ್ಯಪುಸ್ತಕಗಳನ್ನು ಮೀರಿದ ಜ್ಞಾನವನ್ನು ಪಸರಿಸುವ ಮಾಧ್ಯಮವಾಗಬೇಕು. ಜಗತ್ತಿನ ಮಾಹಿತಿಗಳ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಲೋಕಜ್ಞಾನವನ್ನು, ಲೋಕಾನುಭವವನ್ನು ಜನತೆಗೆ ನೀಡಬೇಕು. ಈ ಬಗೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಜ್ಞಾನ ಪ್ರಸಾರದ ಮೂಲಕ ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳು ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಜೀವನವನ್ನು ಹಸನುಗೊಳಿಸಬೇಕು. ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳು ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಜೀವನವನ್ನು ಹಸನುಗೊಳಿಸಬೇಕು. ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಮಹತ್ವದ ವಿಷಯಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯವನ್ನು ಶೇಪಿಂಗ್ ದಿ ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಒಪಿನಿಯನ್ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯವನ್ನು ಮೂಡಿಸಬೇಕು. ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯಗಳನ್ನು ರೂಪಿಸುವ ಸಾಧನವಾಗಬೇಕು. ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳು ಜನರ ಭಾವನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಕೆರಳಿಸಬಾರದು. ಜನರ ಭಾವನೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಉಂಟು ಮಾಡಬಾರದು. ಶುಡ್ ನಾಟ್ ಹರ್ಟ್ ದಿ ಫೀಲಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಪೀಪಲ್ ಎಂದು ಅವರು ಅಜ್ಜನಂತೆ ನಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ಬುಧವಾರ ಹೇಳುತ್ತಿದ್ದರು. ಪತ್ರಿಕಾ ಸ್ವಾತಂತ್ರ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರಿಗೆ ಅಚಲವಾದ ನಂಬಿಕೆ ಇತ್ತು. ಅವರೆಂದೂ ನಮ್ಮ ಸ್ವಾತಂತ್ರ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಹಸ್ತಕ್ಷೇಪ ಮಾಡಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಹಾಗೆಂದು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಸ್ವೇಚ್ಛಾಚಾರಿಗಳಾಗಿ ವರ್ತಿಸಲು ಬಿಟ್ಟಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಇದು ಅಜ್ಜನವರು ಕನ್ನಡ ಪತ್ರಿಕಾರಂಗದ ಪ್ರಮುಖ ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಸಾಧಿಸಿದ ಒಂದು ವಿಶಿಷ್ಟ ಬಗೆಯ ಸಮತೋಲನ. ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರು ತಮ್ಮ ಸಂಸ್ಥೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡುವವರಲ್ಲಿ ಅಪಾರವಾದ ಪ್ರೀತಿ ವಿಶ್ವಾಸವನ್ನು ಹೊಂದಿದ್ದರು. ನಮ್ಮ ಪಾಲಿಗೆ ಪ್ರಿಂಟರ್ಸ್ ಮೈಸೂರು ಅಂದರೆ ಅದೊಂದು ಕೆಲಸದ ಜಾಗವಾಗಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ, ಅದೊಂದು ಅವಿಭಕ್ತ ಕುಟುಂಬವಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಲೈಕ್ ಅನ್ ಅನ್ಡಿವೈಡೆಡ್ ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿ, ಅವಿಭಕ್ತ ಕುಟುಂಬವಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರು ಪ್ರತಿ ತಿಂಗಳು ಸಂಬಳ ವಿತರಿಸುವಾಗ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಬ್ಬ ನೌಕರನನ್ನು ಅವನ ಕುಟುಂಬದ ಕ್ಷೇಮ ಸಮಾಚಾರದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ವಿಚಾರಿಸುತ್ತಿದ್ದರು. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಪ್ರತಿ ವರ್ಷ ಬೋನಸ್ ಕೊಡುವಾಗ ಒಂದು ಸಣ್ಣ ಭಾಷಣ ಮಾಡಿ, ಇದನ್ನು ದುಂದುವೆಚ್ಚ ಮಾಡಬೇಡಿ, ಮನೆಯ ಮಕ್ಕಳ ಪುರೋಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿಗೆ ಬಳಸಿ ಎಂದು ಕಿವಿ ಮಾತು ಹೇಳುತ್ತಿದ್ದರು ನಮಗೆಲ್ಲ. ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳು ಜನರ ಭಾವನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಕೆರಳಿಸಬಾರದು. ದೇ ಶುಡ್ ನಾಟ್ ಹರ್ಟ್ ದಿ ಫೀಲಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಒಪಿನಿಯನ್, ನೋಯಿಸಬಾರದು ಎಂಬುದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ನಿದರ್ಶನ ಕೊಡಲು ಬಯಸುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಲಂಕೇಶ್ ಆಗಷ್ಟೇ ಪ್ರಸಿದ್ಧ ಕವಿಯಾಗಿ, ಕಥೆಗಾರರಾಗಿ, ಸಿನಿಮಾ ನಿರ್ದೇಶಕರಾಗಿ ಬೆಳೆಯುತ್ತಿದ್ದ ದಿನಗಳು. ಸಿನಿಮಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಕೈ ಸುಟ್ಟುಕೊಂಡೂ ಇದ್ದರು. ಆ ಸಮಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಜಾವಾಣಿ ಅಂಕಣವೊಂದನ್ನು ಬರೆಯುವಂತೆ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಆಮಂತ್ರಣ ನೀಡಿತು. ಅವರು ಬರೆಯಲಾರಂಭಿಸಿದರು. ಕೆಲವೇ ದಿನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರ ಅಂಕಣ ಜನಪ್ರಿಯವಾಯಿತು. ಆದರೆ ಲಂಕೇಶರ ಭಾಷೆ ಶೈಲಿಗಳು ಚೇಳಿನ ಕೊಂಡಿಯಂಥದ್ದು. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ವಸ್ತುವಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕೊಂಚ ಪೂರ್ವಾಗ್ರಹಗಳು ಸೇರಿಕೊಳ್ಳುತ್ತಿದ್ದವು. ಈ ಪೂರ್ವಾಗ್ರಹ ಟೀಕೆಗಳನ್ನು ಎಡಿಟ್ ಮಾಡಲು ನಮಗೆ ಹೇಳಿದರು ಶ್ರೀ ಹರಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರು. ಆದರೆ ಏಕೋ ನಾವು ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಕಾಣಿಸುತ್ತೆ ಅದನ್ನು. ಹೀಗಾಗಿ ಜನಪ್ರಿಯತೆ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಕೆಲವೊಂದು ವಲಯಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಲಂಕೇಶರ ಅಂಕಣದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅಸಮಾಧಾನ ಕಾಣಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಿತು. ಲಂಕೇಶ್ ಅವರು ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿಗಳನ್ನ ಲೇವಡಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು. ಆವಾಗ ಬಮ್ ಗುಮ್ ಇತ್ಯಾದಿ ಪ್ರಯೋಗಗಳನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು. ಈ ಪ್ರಯೋಗವಂತೂ ರಾಜಕೀಯ ವಲಯದಲ್ಲಿ ತೀವ್ರವಾದ ಅಸಮಾಧಾನ ಉಂಟು ಮಾಡಿದೆ ಎಂಬುದನ್ನು ನಾನು ಕೇಳಿ ತಿಳಿದಿದ್ದೆ. ಈ ಅಸಮಾಧಾನ ಗಿರಿಯನ್ನು ಅಂದರೆ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರನ್ನು ಮುಟ್ಟಿತ್ತು. ಕೂಡಲೇ ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರು ಅಂಕಣವನ್ನು ನಿಲ್ಲಿಸಿದರು. ಆಗ ಜಾತಿ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಿಂದ ಅಂಕಣ ನಿಲ್ಲಿಸಲಾಯಿತು ಎನ್ನುವ ಮಾತು ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ ವಲಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೇಳಿಬಂತು. ಆದರೆ ಅದು ಸತ್ಯವಲ್ಲ. ಓದುಗರ ಭಾವನೆಗಳನ್ನು ನೋಯಿಸಬಾರದು, ಓದುಗರ ಭಾವನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಹರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಬಾರದು ಎನ್ನುವ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರ ಪತ್ರಿಕಾ ಧರ್ಮವೇ ಅವರ ಅಂಕಣವನ್ನು ನಿಲ್ಲಿಸಿತ್ತು. ಮಾನವೀಯತೆ, ಸ್ನೇಹ, ಪ್ರೀತಿ ವಿಶ್ವಾಸಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರದು ಸದೃಶವಾದ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವ. ಈ ಸಂಬಂಧಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಹಣ, ಆಸ್ತಿ, ಪಾಸ್ತಿ ಅವರ ಹಾದಿಗೆ ಎಂದೂ ಅಡ್ಡವಾಗುತ್ತಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರ ಕಂಪನಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕರಿ ರಾಮಚಂದ್ರ ಅಂತ ಒಬ್ಬರಿದ್ದರು. ಬಿಳಿ ರಾಮಚಂದ್ರ ನಮ್ಮ ಎಡಿಟರ್ ಟಿ ಎಸ್ ರಾಮಚಂದ್ರ ರಾವ್. ಆ ಕರಿ ರಾಮಚಂದ್ರ ನಮ್ಮ ದೊಡ್ಡಪ್ಪನ ಆಪ್ತ ಮಿತ್ರರಾಗಿದ್ದರು. ಅವ್ರ ಮೂಲಕ ನಮ್ಮ ತಂದೆ ಆಯುರ್ವೇದಿಕ್ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಎನ್ನುವುದು ಗೊತ್ತಾಗಿತ್ತು ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಗಳಿಗೆ. ಒಂದು ದಿನ ಟಿ ಎಸ್ ಆರ್ ನನ್ನನ್ನು ಕರೆದು, ನಾಳೆ ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ನಿನ್ನ ತಂದೆಯನ್ನು ಕರೆದುಕೊಂಡು ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರ ಮನೆಗೆ ಹೋಗು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ನನಗೆ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಹೆದರಿಕೆ ಆಯಿತು, ಎದೆ ಪುಕ್ಕ ಅನ್ನಿತು. ಏನಪ್ಪ ತಂದೆಯನ್ನು ಮುಂದೆ ನನ್ನ ವಿಚಾರಣೆ ಏನಾರು ನಡೆಸ್ತಾರೋ, ಏನು ತಪ್ಪು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀನಿ ನಾನು ಅಂತ ಹೆದರ್ಕೊಂಡೆ. ಮರುದಿನ ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆಗೆ ಹತ್ತಿರಕ್ಕೆ ಕಾರ್ ಕಳಿಸ್ಕೊಟ್ರು. ನಾನು ನನ್ನ ತಂದೆ ಜೊತೆ ಹೋದೆ. ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಗಳು ಮನೆಗೆ ಹೋದವು. ಹಜಾರದಲ್ಲೇ ಅವರು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಪ್ರೀತಿ ವಿಶ್ವಾಸದಿಂದ ಬಂದು ಬರಮಾಡಿಕೊಂಡ್ರು. ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಗಳ ಜ್ಞಾನದಾಹ ಮತ್ತು ಕುತೂಹಲಗಳು ವ್ಯಾಪಕವಾದದ್ದು ಹಾಗೂ ವಿಸ್ತಾರವಾದದ್ದು. ಅವರಿಗೆ ಆಯುರ್ವೇದ ವೈದ್ಯಕೀಯ ಪದ್ಧತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಆಸಕ್ತಿ ಇತ್ತು. ಅವರು ನನ್ನ ತಂದೆಯಿಂದ ಆಯುರ್ವೇದದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ರಕ್ತದೊತ್ತಡ, ಮಧುಮೇಹ ಇತ್ಯಾದಿಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಸಮಾಲೋಚನೆ ನಡೆಸಿದರು. ಔಷಧೀಯ ಸಸ್ಯಗಳನ್ನು ಬೆಳೆಯುವುದು ಹೇಗೆ, ಗಿಡಮೂಲಿಕೆಗಳನ್ನು ಬೆಳೆಯುವುದು ಹೇಗೆ ಅಂತ. ಅವರಿಗೆ ತಮ್ಮ ಮನೆ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಜಾಗ ಇತ್ತು, ತೋಟ ಇತ್ತು, ಎಲ್ಲ ಇತ್ತು. ಬರೀ ಬೆಳಿಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಇರಾದೆ ಇತ್ತು. 2 ದಿವಸ ನನ್ನ ತಂದೆಯ ಜೊತೆ ನಾನು ಸಮಾಲೋಚನೆ ನಡೆಸಿದರು. ನನ್ನಿಂದ ಟಿಪ್ಪಣಿಗಳನ್ನು ಬರೆಸಿಕೊಂಡರು. ನನ್ನನ್ನು ತಮ್ಮ ನೌಕರನೆಂದು, ನನ್ನ ತಂದೆಯನ್ನು ನೌಕರನ ಅಪ್ಪ ಎಂದು ಅವರು ನಡೆಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಭಾವಿಸದೆ ಬಂಧು ಮಿತ್ರರಂತೆ ಪ್ರೀತಿಯಿಂದ ನಡೆಸಿಕೊಂಡರು. ತಿಂಡಿ ಕಾಫಿಗಳಿಂದ ಸತ್ಕರಿಸಿದರು. ಇದೊಂದು ನಾನು ಎಂದೆಂದೂ ಮರೆಯಲಾಗದ ಅನುಭವ. ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರಿಗೆ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಜೀವನದ ನೀತಿ ನಿಯಮ ತತ್ವಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ಅಂದರೆ ನಾವೇನು ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಮೊರಾಲಿಟಿ ಅಂತೀವೋ ಅದರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅಪಾರವಾದಂಥ ಕನ್ಸರ್ನ್ ಇತ್ತು, ಕಾಳಜಿ ಇತ್ತು. ಈ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ನೀತಿ ನಿಯಮಗಳು ಸಮಾಜವನ್ನು ಕಲುಷಿತಗೊಳಿಸಬಾರದು, ಅವು ಪವಿತ್ರವಾಗಿರಬೇಕು, ಅವುಗಳನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಸಮಾಜ ಪಾಲಿಸಿಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗಬೇಕು ಎನ್ನುವ ಕಳಕಳಿ ಕೂಡ ಅವರಿಗಿತ್ತು. ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳು ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ನೀತಿ ನಿಯಮಗಳನ್ನು, ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಮೊರಾಲಿಟಿಯನ್ನು ಎತ್ತಿ ಹಿಡಿಯಬೇಕು ಎಂಬ ನಂಬಿಕೆಯೂ ಇತ್ತು. ಬಹುಶಃ 1968 ಅಥವಾ 1969 ಇರಬೇಕು. ಆಗ ಪ್ರಜಾವಾಣಿ ಸಾಪ್ತಾಹಿಕ ಪುರವಣಿಯ ಬಿ ಯು ವೈಕುಂಠರಾಜು ಮತ್ತು ಸದಾಶಿವ ಏಕಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ 1 ತಿಂಗಳು ರಜಾ ಹಾಕಿದರು. ಸುದ್ದಿ ಸಂಪಾದಕರಾಗಿದ್ದಂಥ ಶ್ರೀ ಖಾದ್ರಿ ಶಾಮಣ್ಣನವರು ನನ್ನನ್ನು ಕರೆದು, ಈ 1 ತಿಂಗಳು ಸಾಪ್ತಾಹಿಕ ಪುರವಣಿಯನ್ನು ನೀನು ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರು. ಸಾಪ್ತಾಹಿಕ ಪುರವಣಿಯ ಕುರ್ಚಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂತು ನೋಡುತ್ತೇನೆ. ಮುಂದಿನ ವಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇಕಾದ ಲೀಡ್ ಸ್ಟೋರಿ ಆಗುವಂಥ ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದು ಲೇಖನವೂ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾನೇ ಬೇಕಾಗಬಹುದೇನೋ ಎಂದುಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂಥ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿ. ಆದರೆ ಆವತ್ತಿನ ಟಪಾಲಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಬಾಂಬೆಯಿಂದ ಒಂದು ಸಚಿತ್ರ ಲೇಖನ ಬಂತು. ಅದು ಸಂತೋಷ್ ಕುಮಾರ್ ಗುಲ್ವಾಡಿಯವರು ಬರೆದಿದ್ದಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಆಗ ಗುಲ್ವಾಡಿಯವರು ಬಾಂಬೆನಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಜಾವಾಣಿ ಡೆಕ್ಕನ್ ಹೆರಾಲ್ಡ್ಗೆ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಸ್ಟ್ರಿಂಜರ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದರು. ಗುಲ್ವಾಡಿಯವರು ಪ್ಲೇಬಾಯ್ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ಝೈನ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ಸಚಿತ್ರ ಲೇಖನವನ್ನು, ಒಂದು ಫೋಟೋ ಫೀಚರ್ನ ಕಳಿಸ್ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದರು. ಸ್ವಾರಸ್ಯಕರವಾದಂತಹ ಬರಹ, ಜೊತೆಗೆ ರಸಗುಲ್ಲಾದಂಥ ನಗ್ನ ಅರೆನಗ್ನ ಚಿತ್ರಗಳು, ರಸಿಕರ ಎದೆ ಡಬಗುಟ್ಟಿಸುವಂಥ ಮಾಡೆಲ್ಗಳ ಚಿತ್ರಗಳನ್ನು ಬ್ಲೋ ಅಪ್ ಮಾಡಿಸಿ ಸುಂದರವಾಗಿ ವಿನ್ಯಾಸ ಮಾಡಿ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಪುಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಕಟಿಸಿಬಿಟ್ಟೆ. ಭಾನುವಾರ ಪ್ರಕಟಿಸ್ಬಿಟ್ಟೆ. ತುಂಬ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಬಂದೆ ಅಂತ ನಾನೇ ಬೆನ್ನು ತಟ್ಕೊಂಡ್ಬಿಟ್ಟೆ. ಭಾನುವಾರ ಕಳೆಯಿತು. ಸೋಮವಾರ ಎಂದಿನಂತೆ ಆಫೀಸಿಗೆ ಹೋದಾಗ ಖಾದ್ರಿಯವರಿಂದ ಕರೆ ಬಂತು. ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಗಳು ಕರೀತಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಹೋಗಿ ನೋಡು ಅಂದರು. ನಾನು ಏನು ಗ್ರಹಚಾರ ಕಾದಿದೆಯೋ ಎಂಬ ಅಂಜಿಕೆಯಿಂದಲೇ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರ ಚೇಂಬರನ್ನು ಪ್ರವೇಶಿಸಿದೆ. ಶ್ರೀ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರು ನನ್ನನ್ನು ನಖಶಿಖಾ ಅಂತ ನೋಡಿದರು. ನಂತರ ಹಿಂದಿನ ದಿನದ ಸಾಪ್ತಾಹಿಕ ಪುರವಣಿಯನ್ನು ನನ್ನ ಮುಖಕ್ಕೆ ಎತ್ತಿ ಹಿಡಿದು, ಇದನ್ನು ಈ ಪುರವಣಿಯನ್ನು ಮಾಡಿದವರು ನೀವೇನಾ ಎಂದು ಕೇಳಿದರು. ಹೌದು ಸರ್, ಇಂಥ ಫೋಟೋಗಳನ್ನು ಹಾಕಬಹುದೇ ಎಂದು ಮೆಲುದನಿಯಲ್ಲೇ ಕೇಳಿದರು. ಹೌದು ಸರ್, ಹಾಕಬಹುದು ಎಂದು ನಾನು ವಿನಯಪೂರ್ವಕವಾಗಿ ಉತ್ತರ ಕೊಟ್ಟೆ. ಪ್ರಜಾವಾಣಿ ಓದುಗರು ಇದನ್ನು ಇಷ್ಟಪಡುತ್ತಾರೆಯೇ? ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತಾರೆ ಸರ್. ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂತ ನಿಂಗೆ ಹೇಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತು? ನನಗೆ ಓದುಗರು ಫೋನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಇಂಥದ್ದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಹಾಕಬೇಡಿ, ನಮಗೆ ಇಷ್ಟವಾಗಲ್ಲ, ಪ್ರಜಾವಾಣಿ ಸಂಸಾರವಂದಿಗರ ಪತ್ರಿಕೆ ಎಂದು ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇದಕ್ಕೇನು ಉತ್ತರ ಹೇಳ್ತೀಯ ನೀನು? ನಾನು ನಿರುತ್ತರನಾಗಿ ಕೈ ಕಟ್ಟಿಕೊಂಡು ನಿಂತಿದ್ದೆ. ಇಂಥದ್ದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಹಾಕಬಾರದು. ನಮ್ಮ ಓದುಗರ ರುಚಿ ಅಭಿರುಚಿಗಳು ನಿನಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಚಿತ್ರ ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ನೀನು ನೋಡ್ಕೋ, ಅದೇ ಓದುಗರಿ ಎಂದು ಹೇಳಿ, ಆಯಿತು ನೀನು ಹೋಗು ಅಂದರು. ಚೇಂಬರ್ನಿಂದ ಹೊರಬಂದ ಕೂಡಲೇ, ಏನಪ್ಪ ನೀನು ಹೋಗು ಅಂದರೆ ಏನಿದೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಅಂತ ನನಗೆ ಚಿಂತೆ ಶುರು ಆಯಿತು. ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಮನೆಗೆ ಹೋಗು ಅಂತ ಇದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಇರ್ಬೋದೆ, ನಾಳೆಯಿಂದ ನನ್ನ ಕೆಲಸ ಹೋಯ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಇಡೀ ದಿವಸ ಚಿಂತೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಕೂತಿದ್ದೆ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಸಾಯಂಕಾಲ ಹೋಗೋವಾಗ ಖಾದ್ರಿಯವ್ರ ಹತ್ರ ಹೋಗಿ, ಸರ್ ನಾಳೆ ನಾನು ಆಫೀಸಿಗೆ ಬರಬಹುದೇ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳಿದೆ. ಬಾರಯ್ಯ, ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರು ನಿನ್ನ ಹರೆಯದ ಉತ್ಸಾಹವನ್ನು ಕ್ಷಮಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಬಾರಯ್ಯ ಅಂತಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಅವರು ಒಂದಷ್ಟು ನನಗೆ ಉಪದೇಶ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಅಂಥ ಮೇರು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವದ ಮಾನವೀಯತೆಯ ಗಣಿಯಾಗಿದ್ದ ಗುರುಸ್ವಾಮಿಯವರಿಗೆ ನನ್ನ ಸಾಷ್ಟಾಂಗ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರಗಳು. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತನಾಡಲು ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಟ್ಟು ಪ್ರೀತಿ ಗೌರವ ತೋರಿಸಿದ ಶ್ರೀ ಹರಿಕುಮಾರ್ ಅವರಿಗೂ, ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಂಬಂಧಿಸಿದವರೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಮತ್ತು ನನ್ನ ಕೆಲವು ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಸಹನೆಯಿಂದ ಕೇಳಿದ ನಿಮಗೂ ನನ್ನ ಕೃತಜ್ಞತೆಗಳು. ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
May I please invite lawyer, journalist, and horse racing enthusiast P.G. Beliappa on stage, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. When Hari asked me to speak a few words, I was wondering what I was supposed to say. I'm a lousy speaker, at least extempore. But then he pointed out a few things. A, that our families have known each other for 3 generations. I've been very friendly over these years. And secondly, I'd also worked for Deccan Herald for about 8 years, between 1978 and 85. So I knew something about how the organization functioned, and I was pretty close to Mr. Guruswamy. Mr. Guruswamy in those days was known as the governing director. It's a term not much in use. It's a combination of both the chairman and the managing director. So in Deccan Herald, he was known as GD. I mean, the initials GD signified Mr. Guruswamy. Nobody called him by his name. He was just GD. Now, to me, Mr. Guruswamy was a very paternalistic and maybe a little, a little feudal in his outlook. I don't use the term in a derogatory manner, but more as a positive sense, because Mr. Guruswamy demanded loyalty and trust, and he reciprocated in every way. You know, it's not a one-way communication. He gave you trust and loyalty, and you are expected to do the same in full measure. I can quote from my experiences when I was working in Deccan Herald. For instance, I was in the finance department. I was the secretary of the company. And one of my requirements of my job was to get payment sanctioned by Mr. Guruswamy, or rather the payments, the checks signed by Mr. Guruswamy. Till the very end, till I was there, he never delegated this responsibility to anybody. Mr. Guruswamy insisted on signing each and every check himself. He had a very beautiful Montblanc pen, a fountain pen, and he would sign every check very diligently. The catch, or what could I say, the trust he had in somebody was, he never really looked at what he was signing. Every time he put a check in front of him, he used to ask me, is this okay? Yes. Have you checked? Okay. Shall I sign? Okay. The same thing is repeated time and time again. So what I realized was that once he trusted you implicitly. And it kind of behoved on you that you also had to reciprocate in equal measure. If I'd put a check in front of him, say, pay Beliappa a lakh of rupees, he would have signed it without any hesitation. I mean, such implicit was his trust. So when Hari asked me to talk a few words, I mean, I was a little dubious whether I can make justice to this. But then he said, speak about the race club. I mean, Mr. Guruswamy and I, let's say, had a very common interest. Of course, in Mr. Guruswamy's case, it was a very long-lasting interest. He was very passionate about horses, about horse riding, about horse racing, and about the administration of the turf club. So I thought I should say a few words about that, because not many people here know about his association with that. As far as riding horses go, Mr. Guruswamy, I think, used to go almost every morning to the riding club, which in those days was in Munreddypalia. That's where the present TV tower is situated. It was called the Mysore Lancers Ground. Mr. Guruswamy was all in all in the riding club. He was one of the founding members of the club, and he kind of financed most of the expenditure from his own pocket. The big treat for all the members of the riding club was, I think, every other Sunday, he used to take them out riding. Horses used to go from there to Agram, to Whitefield, to the palace grounds. And then when they finished and came back after the ride, Mr. Guruswamy used to arrange for breakfast, a very sumptuous breakfast, I was told, with every kind of meat and other kind of specialities. So this is a great occasion for everybody in the riding club to look forward to. The other important thing which happened with the riding club was, a lot of the people who rode with him eventually became office bearers of the race club. He laid a groundwork for people to come into the race club. As far as the race club was concerned, Mr. Guruswamy was synonymous with the race club for more than 30 years. For 3 decades, from 1950 to 1980, he was a steward of the race club for 27 years. Nobody has ever had that record, and it's very unlikely anybody is going to be continuously a steward for 27 years. So people actually associated the race club with Mr. Guruswamy. He was the senior steward and the chairman for 8 terms. And it was during his time that the race club actually became a limited company and then became a turf club. This is not a small achievement, because in those days, Bangalore was a very small summering center. We had about 8 days of racing, spread over 1.5 months in June, July. And then to become a turf club, you required the okay of the other 3 major clubs, which were then in the presidency towns, Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. And then required the okay from the Jockey Club of England. Mr. Guruswamy had this excellent rapport with the then Chief Minister, Mr. Vignettes. He got the government to support the turf club. The government actually invited the chairman of Calcutta and Bombay to come to Bangalore as official guests of the government of Karnataka, had a meeting with them, assured them that the government would support this kind of move. And then Mr. Guruswamy followed it up by having a grand dinner in his house. There's some photographs of that in the book. All this helped to pave the way for Bangalore to become a turf authority. Even in those days, Mr. Guruswamy followed the same practice like he followed in Deccan Herald. The same kind of patrician attitude. He put people into positions, gave them power, and allowed them to function. In the case of the turf club, there's a gentleman called Mr. Arshad Ali Khan, Nawab Arshad Ali Khan, who was allowed freedom to innovate and to experiment. The net result was he laid the foundation for a very strong leader. How do I put it? He changed the very structure of how racing was done. And every other race club in India soon followed suit. So from 8 days of racing in a year, by the time Mr. Guruswamy left, we had 60 days of racing in a year, and it was spread over 8 months. Bangalore became a competitor to Bombay, which was then the biggest center in the country, overtook Madras and Calcutta. Mr. Guruswamy was the person who laid this kind of foundation, and he supported Mr. Arshad Ali Khan right through. When we did a book on the turf club in 1995, I asked Mr. Arshad Ali Khan about his experiences. He said Mr. Guruswamy was very, very conservative. He and Mr. Velu was also a director in Deccan Herald and a part of the same kind of group. They were very conservative people. They didn't want people to take rash, what in their view was rash experiments. But because they had faith in him, they allowed him to go his own way. And the best part, what Mr. Arshad Ali Khan told me was, you always knew Mr. Guruswamy had your back. I mean, whatever anybody said or anybody, and the race club was filled with this kind of inter-rivalry between people who were always pulling each other down. He says, Mr. Guruswamy was a rock, and that's why I was able to achieve so much. This is one of his major achievements in the turf club. There are a lot of other things. You see, Bangalore changed totally in those days. The race club didn't have stables, permanent stables, because the racing was a very small summering center. Bangalore was a small summering center. Houses used to be used as stables. For example, this Grand Hotel, which is now at MG Road, where Tonic is, those were stables. Brunton Road, we had a lot of stables. Cunningham Road and Millers Road had a lot of stables. And even Woodlands Hotel were actually stables for horses. A series of unfortunate accidents. There were a fire accident in the palace and something else. And ultimately what happened was they started building permanent stables inside the racecourse and even built some underground or low-level stables. All this laid a nucleus, which now people are enjoying the fruits. So Mr. Guruswamy had a lot to do with this. He was very passionate about this. In fact, to most people in our company, it looked like he was more fond of the race club than of people in Deccan Herald or his own company. I can quote a very simple example. I think Hari also was over there. Deccan Herald had a lot of financial difficulties in the earlier years. Mr. Guruswamy, I think, pledged his own property and assets to keep the company going and to take loans. So I think early 1980, the company did exceedingly well. So there was a board meeting, there was a lunch, and the discussion was how much of dividends do we pay out to our shareholders, or what kind of presents we should give them. There were a lot of outlandish suggestions. Somebody even suggested an ambassador car, and then finally we settled on a radio, a big radio. The meeting was over. The number of shareholders were very few. Mr. Guruswamy had the bulk of the shares. He was the person who funded most of the company's business. So the meeting was over, and as we were leaving, Mr. Guruswamy called me and says, "What do we give as a present to all the Turf Club members?" I said, "Sir, they've got nothing to do with us." He said, No, they're like my family. They've been with me for 30 years. How can you not give them?" I said, "Sir, you call them and give them a lunch or a dinner. You can't give money of this company to them." I'm just saying this to illustrate the fact that Mr. Guruswamy was so passionately fond of the Turf Club and its members that he thought it was part of his extended family. The same thing, I think, held good even for the Deccan Herald group. Most of the employees had been there for many, many years, long before I joined and after I left. And he had the same paternalistic kind of view of all of them. Since Hari has said, speak something about connection with our families, I can quote one or two personal examples. You see, the Turf Club, it's a very peculiar way of electing members. For some odd reason, people spend a lot of money, give parties, beg, borrow, and do all kinds of things to become members. So the first year when they finally opened out this kind of membership, this in 1982, I had applied to become a member. I had given in my application. My father had proposed my name and two others, and we given it in. So just out of courtesy, I told Mr. Guruswamy, "Sir, I put in this application. I just wanted to inform you that I'm putting this in." Mr. Guruswamy's reaction was very different. He says, "No, you cannot become a member of this club." So I was very shocked. I said, "Sir, you have been a chairman of this club." And those days I used to write racing also for the paper. I go to the races. He says, "No, I don't want you to ruin your life." I said, "How am I going to ruin my life?" He says, "The easiest way to ruin your life is to make you a member of this club." The general thought was you want to introduce somebody to gambling and he's going to be finished. For a few days, we used to discuss this almost every day. Then he told me that he owned horses. He never bet. And it seems he had been an accountant also in his younger days, in his father's time. So it seems he used to tally all his accounts in the evening before he went home. He says, "You'll go off to the races. Who's going to tally the accounts?" That was his... So I said, "Sir, don't worry about all that." Then he said, "Okay, if you're so confident or you're so, let's say, eager to become a member of the race club, I'll make you a member, or I'll see that you get in. But you have to promise me one thing." He asked me, "How much do you gamble? Do you gamble?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How much do you gamble?" So I gave him a small figure. He said, No, that's too much. Cut down your gambling. You promise me that you're not going to exceed these kind of limits. I said, "Okay, sir." So the next day, just the last day before this forms were to be filed and the elections to be started, and the process to be started, he sent her to the Turf Club, got a fresh form. And he said, "I'll propose your name. And you ask your father," and somebody seconded. In fact, actually I forgot. When I told him my father has signed my form, he says, "Your father is an idiot, to make you a member of this club. And since your grandfather is not there, I have to be, behave like your grandfather." There's a very interesting sequel to this. The last minute people went around canvassing. I also went to a few places. People who knew my family, people who knew me, and just to inform them that I'm standing. There were 74 candidates for about 8 seats. And this fairly large, very successful jeweler on Commercial Street, I had known the family, and he knew who I was. So I went to him and told him I'm standing for election. So he looked at the list and he said, "See, it's very difficult, Beliappa. I like you, I know you, but you have no chance in this." So I said, "Why?" He said, "No, we have the finance secretary, we have the IGP, we have some other IAS officer, you have my brother, there are so many guys over there. How can I vote for you? There are only 6 to 8 seats. Maybe next year or the year after you come along." Then he was going down the list and he says, "See, there are one or two people like this Shrikant Datta was also contesting that year. He said, see, Maharaja, my sir, okay, he's going to come. Then he went down the list. My name was PG Beliappa. So in the list, alphabetic list, I was under P, Anapale Kanda Ganapati Beliappa. So he came to that and he said, see, you see this Guruswamy, he will see that his group is going to make this person win. So I thought it was a cue for me. I said, no, that's me. And I quit. I mean, for the record, I did win very well, and the gentleman's brother and all of them didn't do very well at all. And for a last incident again to show that his commitment to the turf club, much later I became the chairman of the race club. We had a very major confrontation with the government in 1988. The government wanted to take over the land and the license of racing and so many other things. The club, which is normally driven by disarray, joined together to fight the government. And the suggestion was made to me to get two of the warring factions, Mr. Velu and Mr. Guruswamy are on one side. There was Mr. Ramakrishna and Mr. Kumar Siddhana. I mean, some of you may be familiar with those names. They were on the other side. But we went and got all of them together and said, you have to come and show solidarity, at least in front of the public and the government. So Mr. Velu said, why don't you ask Mr. Guruswamy to come and present a cup? From what I gather, Mr. Guruswamy was not very well. He had a colostomy and he was carrying a bag. So I rang him up tentatively and said, sir, we're having this. It doesn't matter. I just want to inform you. Mr. Guruswamy immediately told me, I'm coming. I said, sir, you can't walk. Please don't come. He says, no, I'll come up to the paddock. I'll walk up a few steps. I'll give the cup and I'll go back. I said, okay, please do come. So what I did was I told the gatekeepers, open the paddock, let the car come into the paddock. Come very near to where he's going to make the presentation. When the car came in, Mr. Guruswamy got very upset. He told the driver, there's no way you're going into the paddock. So I said, sir, I'm asking him to come into the paddock. He says, you young boys don't know anything. Nobody has ever done anything like this. I'm not going to break this rule. I said, sir, you can't walk. He says, no, I refuse to go in this car. So he got down from the car. He actually walked, with great difficulty holding his stick. He gave the cup away. The crowd, the public really loved it. They really roared for him, cheered him. And then on the way back, they started shouting at me, what kind of a sadist are you? Get the car in. So he got the car in. Mr. Guruswamy protested all the way, saying, this is not correct, this is not correct. But he did get into the car and he did come and support us. I'm just stating all this to say that his commitment to the turf club was total. I can go on and on about some of the familial connections. One or two actually were quite interesting. I didn't know about them either. One was about Hari's mother, Mrs. Nettakallappa. When Tilak got married, he had come home with Sujata. So the day when he came, both of them came home, then Sujata told me, or rather she told my mother, do you know something? So my mother asked her what? It seems Mrs. Nettakallappa said, when she had learned that Tilak and Sujata were coming home, that this is the same house I went when I was about to get married. It seems Mr. Guruswamy wanted to see Mrs. Nettakallappa before the match was kind of fixed. And they wanted a neutral ground. So I think Mrs. Jambati Nettakallappa's parents brought her to our house. Mr. Guruswamy came and saw and approved. So it seems Nettakallappa didn't have anything to do with it. Mr. Guruswamy approved and the match was done. I mean, there are a lot of such small incidents which show that we were pretty close. And so actually I feel very happy that Hari actually asked me to speak a few words. Mr. Guruswamy had been a very good boss to me. It's a great life I had in Deccan Herald. I'm very thankful to Hari to call me today.
May we please have author and historian Janaki Nair.
Let me start also by thanking Mr. Hari Kumar for inviting me to this historic occasion and for asking me to do what I do best. So I did not know K N Guruswamy personally. I'm not going to continue the warm ways in which he has been acknowledged by other speakers. But I have to say that I'm particularly honored to be here, not just as a lifelong reader of the Deccan Herald, and over the last decade or so also of the Prajavani, but since I was fortunate enough to have have had the opportunity of working in the iconic space in what I describe as a crucially formative decade of the 1980s. And finally, I also had the extraordinary privilege of reading the Deccan Herald from its inception in 1948 over a 4-month period in 1999 while beginning research on post-independence Bangalore. So I feel particularly pleased to be at this event. So let me first start by saluting Deccan Herald and Prajavani and the allied publications for the brave and passionate detachment with which they have continued to report on issues that concern not just the city, but the state and the Republic of India itself. Thank you for remaining a shining beacon amidst this gathering gloom. I am sure many people in this audience will join me in saying that we all take courage from your courage. I will not dwell too long on the marvelous and personally moving tribute that Mr. Hari Kumar has written on his grandfather and his grandmother. He was, as his life demonstrates, a truly remarkable figure. And I think we've had at least 3 different kinds of versions of how remarkable he was from previous speakers. I will instead devote the time allotted to me into 2 parts. The first, to look at how we may view the achievement of somebody like K N Guruswamy within a longer history of entrepreneurship and enterprise in the Mysore state setting. And secondly, I will look at the career of this newspaper that he founded as an institution and how it became and remains, and I'm quoting now from Pothen Joseph's first editorial in June 1948, a listening post and a watchtower for the times in which we live. Let me start by giving you a very potted history of what predated Guruswamy's entrepreneurship in the colonial period. Colonialism did not promote industrialization, as we all well know. Indeed, segments of the economy that were doing pretty well were thriving under Tipu Sultan, such as textiles and armaments, for example, were thoroughly dismantled with the onset of colonial rule. The Mysore state remained a primarily agrarian society right up until the last quarter of the 19th century, when there was only very sluggish investment in industry. The establishment of the Bangalore woolen mills by Standish Lee in 1877 was one of the earliest efforts to mobilize capital for new industry. But here too, Lee had to fight off competition from an unexpected source, the jails, which also produced jhools or house blankets, obviously at very low prices. Capital was very hard to come by, and Lee teamed up with the Abkari contractor and emerging merchant and building contractor Arcot Narayanaswamy Mudaliar, another very well-known Bangalore presence, to establish the mills on a firmer footing. But even this effort fell to foreign hands, namely Binny and Company, by 1886. But in Arcot Narayanaswamy Mudaliar, we see the first signs of a willingness of indigenously accumulated capital, largely through Abkari and construction contracts, seeking new avenues of investment, even if they failed. Now, the difficulties of raising indigenous capital persisted through the early decades of the 20th century. There were some lonely sentinels, textile mills and a tobacco factory, and of course, the coal mines, which were largely in foreign or outsider hands. So the question that strikes historians is, of course, why did the large cotton trade of Davangere, for example, not translate into investment in textile mills, for example? Why did Mysore not produce a class with the wherewithal and vision to transit from merchant activity into industrial production, like, say, the Nadars did in the neighboring Tamil region? These are puzzling questions. But Harish Damodaran has, in his recent work on India's New Capitalists, reminded us of how critical the inheritance of caste was to capital accumulation and to investment in modern India. I advise you, those of you who have not seen this book, to please read it. Now, this was a problem that Tipu Sultan had well recognized. So he imagined and asserted a role for the state as a mobilizer and distributor of resources. That recognition again recurs in the 1920s and in the 1930s, when the Mysore government recognized the importance of state aid to industries, to give the state a decisive push in the direction of industrialization. There were some, small-scale agro-based industrial efforts and some interesting successes, such as the soap factory, brick and tile factories, and so on. But constantly the refrain was that raising capital in Bangalore was very hard. And this is, I'm quoting now from the words of Venkatachalaiah, who was head of the Mysore chrome tanning factory, when he spoke to the Indian Industrial Commission in 1916. Private capital was simply not drawn to large investments. And so Mysore embarked on a period of state-led industrialization. In fact, Mysore became the first Indian state to appoint a trade commissioner in London, something that caused a great deal of grief to the government of India. And we know that Vishveshwarayya's two important projects, the Krishnarajasagar Dam and the Bhadravati Iron and Steel Works, were opposed by the government of India. And later on, fervent efforts made by Vishveshwarayya and Mirza Ismail to establish a car factory in Bangalore were thwarted. But by the Second World War, and we've had some reference to the Second World War and the kinds of profits that Guruswamy himself has made in this period, it was a major opportunity, a major break, particularly for textile merchants in Bangalore. And Dhondusa was, of course, one of them. He's one of those who was the early investor in Deccan Herald. So it is a very significant and striking thing that K N Guruswamy, just a few months after India won independence, decided to invest his own capital, accumulated through abkari contracts, in a far riskier venture, the newspaper. Now, I was amused, I should say, but also interested to learn from Hari Kumar's book that that excerpt of E.W. Scott, which has been printed, in which, if that is to be believed, and I quote, "The main purpose of starting Deccan Herald was to fend off prohibition from becoming a reality in Mysore." So it was an interest in building public opinion. I think we had these wonderful words earlier from previous speakers as well about the importance of building public opinion. But elsewhere in the book, we also are told that the main purpose was to buttress the non-Brahmin movement of which Arcot Ramaswamy Modliar was a part. So whatever the impetus may have been, unlike some other contemporary entrepreneurs of the city, such as, for example, Kasturi Ranga Shetty, who would branch out from agro-based industries into an emerging site of private investment education to establish the famous RV institutions, Guruswamy chose the world of print. Despite very severe setbacks, as we've heard today from both Justice Venkatachalaiah and from Hari Kumar himself, and as his book shows, there was near closure at one point, and yet the paper survived to become a pioneer in publications, a lead which it has enjoyed for many decades since. Guruswamy himself, unlike his father, seems to have avoided any truck with politics. But he, of course, as we have already heard, supported through philanthropic efforts the caste association of the Edigas. And of course, as we all know, the 20s and the 30s, J. Tamaya's book clearly points this out, was the heyday of caste associations, as caste itself was recognized as a form of capital. But Guruswamy also inaugurated a new phase in philanthropy when he went beyond caste and religion to donate the tower with the cross on top to the St. Luke's Church in the Old City area in the 1970s, and 1930s, while Mirza Ismail was the one who donated the Lord's table in mahogany to that church. So that's just a small aside, but I'm just, in what I'm going to say in the second part of what I want to turn to, what was this world of journalism in Mysore to which printers Mysore and Deccan Herald in particular entered? So what was this newspaper world in Mysore into which Guruswamy had stepped? The field was dominated more by weeklies and monthlies rather than by dailies, and most of them were in Kannada. And apart from a small handful established in Mysore, Tumkur, Davangere, and KGF, most of these papers were run from Bangalore. Now, there is a very small, a relatively unknown book by R. Ramakrishna about press and politics in an Indian state, which exhaustively lists the publications that were licensed in Mysore state from as early as the 1850s, but that does not include Mathrubhumi, which is the journal which was referred to. That does not, so it looks like this journal, this paper to which Guruswamy had contributed. So perhaps it remained only a twinkle in Garudachar's eye at that time. But what is striking is that most papers at this time, and particularly those that survived, were edited by Brahmins. As Srinivas Havanu's excellent historical introduction to Kannada Patrika Suchi suggests, the preoccupations were quite interesting. In 78-79, for instance, he cites the discussions in a paper which revolved around whether Brahmins were permitted sea travel without loss of caste as per the Shastras. And incidentally, this question of sea travel without loss of caste was a preoccupation well into the 20th century, even amongst other kinds of groups such as the Akhil Bharata Veerashaiva Mahasabha. But there was growing public interest, and this is important to understand because the term public has come up so often in the last three speeches which have been made. There was growing public interest in and a critique of the Mysore monarch and his bureaucracy. And many newspapers had to pay the price for that critique. Deshabhimani, for instance, in the late 19th century, bit the dust for raising certain uncomfortable questions. There were two other preoccupations among the newly emerging dominant classes of the Lingayats and the Vokligas, who also began their own papers in the second decade of the 1900s, when questions of caste were more strongly foregrounded and a questioning of government actions was even clearer. Mysore Star, for example, specifically championed the cause of the backward classes and played not a small role in the eventual passage of what has been already referred to as the Miller Committee report, the very foundational report which actually accorded reservations in education and government jobs to backward classes by 1921. This was a historic first, as some of you may know. Caste publics asserted their own rights to newspapers. So you had a large number of papers devoted to specific castes, Vokligara Patrike, Devangara Patrike, Kunchatigara Patrike, Gurubara Patrike, etc., which were started to voice specific community concerns and achievements. Yet even when the wave of nationalism overcame the world of journalism, I would say in the 1930s, really speaking, in major papers such as Vishwa Karnataka, Thai Nadu, Truth, Prajamatha, etc., the field of journalism was dominated by upper castes. P. Ramaya, Veerakeshri Sitaram Shastri, Tita Sharman, DVG, and many others. DVG founded this paper called The Karnataka in 1913, which was an unusual English bi-weekly. But the interesting thing about him was that he was very vocal in his opposition to any kind of dilution of merit. And he was a strong opponent and critic of the ambitious schemes of Vishvesharaya. So, Vishvesharaya was trying to drag Mysore into modernity, and somebody like DVG was opposed to this kind of force with which Mysore was being dragged into modernity. So, but I want to return to this moment of 1948 and the founding of the paper, because no doubt the appointment of Pothan Joseph in 1948 set the tone for a marked professionalism of the paper from the start. And this is, I think, quite important. He had experience of both setting up and running newspapers elsewhere, and he steered the ship in the crucial first decade. And here is what he declared in his opening editorial on June 17th, 1948. I'll just read 2 or 3 lines from here. 12 months ago, India occupied the status of a subject country, but as if in the twinkling of an eye, we must pardon some of this prose. He was given to, I would say, rather purple prose. We find ourselves consolidating the results of a bloodless revolution, giving us the freedom to shape our own future. Many interests have become suddenly articulate, and stagnant systems of administration are so revivified that we are making of India a better integrated and more comprehensive machinery of high voltage for the progress of millions. And then he goes on to say, here the press could serve as a listening post and a watchtower for truth to tell, and how prescient he was. India, south of the Vindhyas, has still to pull her full weight in the guidance of national policy. And it continues, of course. Now, the question is, how did DH and Prajavani actually fulfill that promise? When the field of journalism was segmented, as I have demonstrated, catering to very specific publics, Deccan Herald and Prajavani came on the scene as papers that looked beyond narrow confines to the promises of the newly independent nation. And I want to just give a small sampling of the kinds of things that were covered in Deccan Herald. And here, obviously, I'm influenced by my own interests in labor history and in urban history in my choice of these examples. We already know from Hari Kumar's excerpt of Venkatachalaiah's book, in his own book, that DH's reportage of the HAL workers' conditions was seen as somehow exacerbating the problems that the workers were posing to HAL in the 1950s. Clearly, Deccan Herald had become the gadfly even then. But there were other things that were reported which are quite interesting, and I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples. The Mysore sandalwood soap factory, for example, in 1960, recorded a historic 30% profit, for which workers were given a production bonus, leading K.C. Reddy to remark that it was making too much profit for a state-run unit, and so the price of soap has to be reduced. Imagine that. There was a sense that the state-run institutions should not, in fact, make that much profit. But, you know, HAL was earning record profits in 1963, 64, 67. We see a steady kind of reportage of the kinds of, the kinds of achievements of the public sector, which at that time dominated the landscape in a city like Bangalore, HMT and BEL. But at the same time, we see that there were groups like the Bangalore Civic Forum, a very influential group, but also many important economists, town planners, and politicians who were calling for a halt to industrial expansion in Bangalore in the late 1960s and early 1970s, because they were alarmed at the way in which the city was growing, and they felt that a halt to industrial production was probably the answer. Of course, time has taken us in a completely different direction. Now, in the interest of time, I just want to move fast forward to the 1980s, which were an important decade for the newspaper for, I believe, initiatives that were taken for 2 kinds of inclusion. The paper reflected the concerns and interests of the growing metropolis, of course, and an increasingly wealthy state, while also forging organic links with what was being done in the name of development in the distant reaches of Karnataka, that's to say, not just in the cities, but also in the towns and villages. In addition to assessing projects in the Moffisil, there was attention to the problems and aspirations of the working class, a close coverage of issues related to grievances and strikes in a city that was, as I said a moment ago, dominated by the public sector. So if you read the pages of the Deccan Herald for a coverage of the historic 1981 public sector strike, for example, which involved 1.25 lakh workers, it was almost as if the city was on the brink of a revolution, a storming of the Winter Palace. I mean, there's banner headlines almost on a daily basis for that 80-day period. And on February 4th, 1981, when the farmers' jathas entered the city from Dasarali, they were greeted with food by the workers of Bangalore, an extraordinary mingling of worker and peasant, of red and green. Likewise, the equally historic Gokak agitation in 1982, which foregrounded Kannada learning in schools, was debated and discussed at length in its pages. That was not all. The DH paid equal attention to the arts, meticulously covering every art opening, however small, and every theatre performance that debuted in the city and the state. It spotted ads of movies in all languages, not just in Kannada or in English. It documented the long and innovative struggle of Bangalore's artists for a proper art gallery and an equally strident demand for a film studio. But there was another kind of inclusion that was consciously nurtured in the Deccan Herald during the 1980s. The unspoken and perhaps unacknowledged upper caste domination of journalistic spaces was broken when untapped journalistic talent that had been excluded from newsrooms for not being endowed with the necessary cultural capital was actually brought in. The new young journalists were not only sensitive to a wide range of issues in Karnataka, but were above all equipped very well in both English and Kannada, leading to a tectonic transformation. I would say it was a tectonic transformation of the news desk. And, of course, of news resulting in dazzling reportage and editing in general. Despite being an English language paper, unusual investments were made in training non-Kannada speaking journalists in Kannada to be able to report and write intelligently on matters that increasingly required knowledge of the local language. This could not be left to the Moffisil desk alone. I would say that the Deccan Herald pioneered the shift in the 1980s with long-lasting consequences for the kinds of coverage and protection of fearless speech that continues right up to the present day. There have been other path-breaking moves, as in the decision in 2012 to host an Ambedkar Jayanti, April 14th, special edition of Prajavani, guest edited by Devanur Mahadeva, signaling a very radical shift in content itself. And I say this is something of a collector's item. And there have been other pioneering efforts. Prajavani, for instance, has hosted and run samvadas on critical issues in which leading Kannada literatures have participated. Of course, we had a rather amusing example of one Kannada literature whose language actually disturbed Guruswamy enough for his column to be stopped, namely Pilankesh. But more recently, there has been an attempt to involve literatures more fully. So one of these samvadas has been brought together in a small and insightful book called Vachana Sahitya Samvada in 2014 that brought together one of the finest and long-running debates that was carried on in the pages of Prajavani on the meaning and importance of the Vachana inheritance. And in 2021, as recently as 2021, there has been an issue of Mayura that was devoted to sophisticated writings by feminist writers and critics. Now, we could go on and on, but I know Ravichandra will stop me. I could go on listing the achievements of these publications right up to the present day in shaping public opinion constructively and intelligently. In doing so, we will still be paying tribute to the foresight and determination of its founder. And I can say, tongue-in-cheek, that he will be pleased to know that thus far we have successfully also kept prohibition at bay. Thank you.
I am Mr. Hari Kumar's son, also Mr. Guruswamy's great-grandson. And on behalf of my father and the rest of the family, I would like to thank each and every one of you who have been part of this celebration of Tata, as we refer to him as in the family. A special thank you to all the speakers, and a big thank you to BIC for having us here. And once again, thank you.